Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to our conference. Our first topic is the best and worst arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. How do you know that Jesus rose from the dead for you? Well, that's because the Gospels say so. But how do you trust the Gospels? Because they're inspired. How do you know they're inspired? Well, we don't even know who wrote them. It turns out that the Gospels actually wrote their stories to convince us that Jesus rose from the dead. But when you look at the stories carefully, you see that the contradictions between them show that the stories are contrived, and there is no good evidence that Jesus actually rose from the dead. The Muslim belief that God raised Jesus into heaven is based on the Quran. But if we were to leave the Quran aside and look at the Gospels, we would have no confidence that Jesus actually rose from the dead. These are the words of Shabir Ali, a leading Muslim apologist, in one of his classical debates. But it is not only Muslim apologists who deny that Jesus rose from the dead. There are plenty of liberal scholars doing the same thing. People like the Jesus Seminar, led by Robert W. Funk. John Dominic Crossan, Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography. Notice that it was a national bestseller. Dr. Gerd Ludemann wrote many books attacking the truth of Christianity. And of course, perhaps best known, Bart Ehrman, former evangelical who has now dedicated his life to convincing people that Jesus never rose from the dead, did not do miracles, and the New Testament is not trustworthy. It gets into the popular media as well. You see it in magazines like Newsweek. You see it on TV and, of course, the internet. There's no shortage of people challenging the claims that Jesus rose from the dead. And in a sense, therefore, we have an uphill battle if we want to convince people that he did do so. There's a couple of points, though, that we do have to remember. Number one, as we see in 1 Peter 3:15, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and prepared always with a defense, apologia, to everyone, asking you for a reason concerning the hope in you, with meekness and fear. So to give answer, to tell people, to try to give them reasons to believe what we believe, it's a command. It's not an option. And the crux of that hope that is in us is that Jesus rose from the dead. We see in John chapter 2, when the Jewish leaders challenged Jesus, asking him what sign he did after he cleansed the temple. And we see that Jesus answered and said to them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. This is what authenticates Jesus. It is what he pointed to repeatedly. According to Romans 1:3-4, Jesus Christ our Lord is declared to be the Son of God with power according to the resurrection from the dead. And so if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then it's the end of story for Christianity. Even the Bible says, if Christ has not risen, your faith is futile. If Jesus did not rise, then Christianity is not true. Jesus was a false teacher. It is the crux, the crucial point, the linchpin, the sine qua non of Christianity. And therefore, it is reasonable for people to ask, in the light of the size of this claim, whether it's true or not. And we must be able to give reasons to convince them. Well, let's look at some of the reasons Christians will give to believe in the resurrection, and ask yourself, are these good arguments, good reasons, not good reasons? You might have heard some of these before. For example, Jesus must have risen from the dead because the apostles said he did. If Jesus didn't rise, why didn't the Roman or Jewish authorities produce his body when the apostles started preaching the resurrection? They could have ended the claims right away. The disciples could not have stolen the body because Pilate posted a crack Roman guard who would have been executed had they fallen asleep on duty, and so certainly would not have done so. These are some reasons Christians and evangelical scholars have come up with for the resurrection of Jesus. You've probably heard some of them. Here's another one. According to the gospel books, the first witnesses of the risen Jesus were women. And since the testimony of women was not valued or even legally valid in first century Israel, no one making up such a story would have made the first witnesses to be women. That detail, therefore, indicates that the accounts are true. And one more, you might or might not have heard of this, is making its rounds in scholarly circles. Scholars have concluded that 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 is actually a creed formulated by the early church and taught to Paul 3 years after his conversion, so about AD 36, which is proof that the church believed in the resurrection from the very first. So these are common arguments that are often brought up to defend the resurrection. Generally, people will say that that first reason, the resurrection is true because the apostles said so. That's not a very good reason, but the rest are all good reasons. Actually, out of these 5 arguments, only that first one is a good argument. The rest of them are all bad arguments that shouldn't be used. As Christians, we do want to be bulletproof. We do not want to give arguments that are easy to refute. Okay? And so we'll go through arguments and see which ones are not good and shouldn't be used, and which ones are the good ones that we should be using. Okay? Why does it all matter? Well, let me tell you this story. This was published in American Atheist back in the 3rd quarter of 2013. This is a story of this fellow, Dustin Lawson. And he tells his story, how he came to Christ at age 8, he says. In his senior year in high school, he was challenged by his pastor, who said to him, "What more important career could you choose than to lead people to Christ and help them grow spiritually?" He turned down offers of modeling and acting. He memorized large portions of the Bible and apologetics. He grew to love evangelism. And according to his own personal testimony, he said, "All I wanted to do with my life was preach and write for Christ." And then during his senior year, he says, "I decided to spend time being mentored by an apologist. And there was no other apologist that I wanted to be mentored by more than Josh McDowell." He's actually a very famous Christian apologist. You've probably heard of him before. And he applied to Josh McDowell to be his assistant. He kept calling his secretary every single week until finally he was accepted. And the secretary actually said to him, "It sounds like you are going to be the next Josh McDowell." Well, he spent a year working with Josh, traveling 100,000 miles all over the world, preaching the gospel, and then this happened. But one evening, while Josh was speaking to a crowd of parents in Southern California, something triggered my skepticism. Josh was going through arguments that he thought proved the resurrection of Christ. The specific argument my skepticism started on was this one. People die for lies, but they don't die for lies that they know are lies. So the resurrection must be true because the apostles would not have died for that belief if they knew it was false, and they would have known it was false since they were eyewitnesses. As I thought about that argument, I realized it takes too many things for granted. There's no record in the Bible of how any of the disciples died, let alone that they died for their belief in the resurrection. Even if there were such a record, the gospel books are dated no earlier than 30 years after the time of Jesus. That's a lot of time. And the letters wouldn't have been widely circulated for decades, if not centuries, since there was no quick transportation, no internet, and no printing press. There was probably no chance for any eyewitness skeptics to look at the letters and either refute or substantiate the claims of the New Testament letters. And based on such issues, he became more and more skeptical, and he ended up renouncing Christ and becoming an atheist. Now notice, of all the things he picks on, What it was the central issue that caused him to doubt? It's there in the yellow. The date of the gospel books, they're dated no earlier than 30 years after the time of Jesus. Now, that's not true. Actually, the earliest gospel book, Matthew, was published 8 years after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. But interestingly, virtually every evangelical scholar and apologist accepts this claim of 30 plus years and look at the result. And this is why, folks, it is essential to have all of your facts straight and to deploy them properly, because false claims can lead people to doubt. Every one of the points here that Lawson has made is actually very easy to demolish. But this is why, folks, we want to use really good arguments. We don't want to use bad arguments. If we use bad arguments and people debunk them, it will just strengthen them in their belief that Christianity is not true and the resurrection is not defensible. So, I hope we're clear on why we're doing this. And we're going to look first at the 5 worst arguments for the resurrection. Now, do note, these are not arguments against the resurrection. These are arguments that Christians often use to defend the resurrection, but arguments that really are not valid and should not be used. Here we go. Worst argument number 1. If Jesus didn't rise, why didn't the Roman or Jewish authorities produce his body when the apostles started preaching the resurrection? They could immediately have proven that the claim that Jesus rose was false by producing his body and showing it to the people. A show of hands, people who've heard this argument before? Not that I can see your hands. Show of hands, people who think this is a good argument. Not that I can see your hands. What is wrong with this argument? Well, ask yourself this. When was Jesus crucified? And the answer is on Passover. Now ask yourself, when did the apostles begin publicly preaching that Jesus had risen from the dead? And the answer is on Pentecost, Shavuot, Acts chapter 2. Next question. What is the length of time between Passover and Pentecost? And the answer is 50 days. You see that in Deuteronomy 16, 1-12. And then the last and crucial question for you is, what would happen to a body in an unrefrigerated tomb in 50 days? And the answer is, it would have rotted into unrecognizability. According to John Nernoff III, a retired pathologist, a face will become nearly unrecognizable after several days at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about the average temperature in Jerusalem for the time period in question. Arpad A. Vosh, in Beyond the Grave, published in Microbiology Today, gives a general formula that indicates that under the conditions in question, the body would actually have skeletonized in about 70 days. And injuries that affect the rate as well, since damage to the skin increases blood loss, insect and bacterial action, and Jesus' body had been severely mangled by the scourging he'd received, as well as the crucifixion, it seems clear that his body would not have been recognizable after 50 days. And that means that when the apostles started preaching, it would have been done no good for any authorities to bring forth a body and say, see, here's his body. Nobody could have recognized it. Nobody could know whether that was the body of Jesus or not. Okay? This standard was actually also held by the Jews of Jesus' day. In Midrash Rabbah Genesis, we read, you cannot testify to the identity of a corpse save by the facial features together with the nose, even if there are marks of identification in his body and garments. Again, you can testify only within 3 days of death. And as well from the Babylonian Talmud tractate Yevamot, evidence of identification may be tendered by those only who saw the corpse within 3 days after death. Okay? So even Jewish law recognized this fact. Now these are not quite from the first century, but it's unlikely that they had better ways of knowing in the first century than later. And so as the skeptic points out, the body may well have been in the tomb, but when the apostles started preaching, there would have been no point to bringing it forth. Okay? The skeptic might even say this is why they waited 50 days. And therefore, this is why this is a bad argument. Don't use it. Worst argument number 2. The disciples could not have stolen the body because Pilate posted a crack Roman guard for the very purpose of preventing anyone from stealing the body. The soldiers of the guard would have been executed had they fallen asleep on duty, and so they certainly would not have done so. And Jesus' untrained and distraught disciples could not have overpowered armed and trained soldiers. You hear this one from apologists all the time. The picture we're given is this, the standard typical picture, a sealed tomb with 2 guys in skirts holding spears. In point of fact, the Roman guard was probably at least 16 men, possibly even 20 or 30. And they were trained and they were heavily armed. So in point of fact, it's absolutely true that Jesus' disciples could not have overpowered such a group of people, even if they wanted to. So what's wrong with this argument? Why is it a bad argument? Here's why. Here's the account of the setting of the guard when the chief priests and Pharisees come to Pilate and ask for a guard. What's the first thing to notice in this account? When is it done? On the next day. Which means the guard wasn't actually set right away, but sometime the next day. So the body could have been stolen before. You have to ask yourself, would the Roman soldiers have bothered to move the rock to check if the body was still there? Maybe, maybe not. But it doesn't really matter because as we continue the story, we see this. Command that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day. Okay. Why until the 3rd day? Because that's what Jesus said, he would rise on the 3rd day. Okay. So the guards are only there until the 3rd day. After that, they leave. Remember, the public preaching began on Pentecost 50 days later. So actually, the disciples had 47 days after the guard left, during which the tomb was unguarded and the body could have been stolen had they wanted to do so. And any skeptic who looks at this story in detail will see that right away. And when you bring up this argument, he's going to point that out. Of course, they could have stolen it. You see, this is why it's not a good argument, and you shouldn't be using it. You cannot overlook the time factor. Worst argument number 3. The majority of scholars agree that the tomb of Jesus was empty. This is part of what's called the minimal facts approach of popularized by Gary Habermas and Michael Licona. Why is this a bad argument? Okay. Because even if this were true, and I don't think it is, but if it were true, an empty tomb by itself doesn't convince anybody. The claim that a dead man came back to life is so difficult to accept that just about any other explanation for the empty tomb, even far-fetched ones, would be preferred. But if you don't agree with this, consider this. Here is Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb, and she sees the stone has been rolled away, and she runs to Peter and says, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Okay? She sees the empty tomb. She doesn't think Jesus rose from the dead. She thinks somebody must have taken the body. Now, you might say, okay, maybe, maybe she didn't really look in. But then we see this, okay? Peter and John have gone in, looked, went away, unconvinced. And she's still at the empty tomb. Jesus shows up behind her, shows up there and asks her, woman, why are you weeping? Okay? She thinks it's the gardener. Okay? Maybe he's behind her. Sorry, that's not the gardener. Yeah, she thinks it's the gardener. Maybe he sees the sun is still coming up behind him. She only sees a silhouette. Maybe her eyes are filled with tears. But she says to him, sir, if you have carried him away, Tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away. Okay? She sees the empty tomb. Not for a moment does she think Jesus rose from the dead. She thinks the body has been moved. She's still not with the program. Empty tomb didn't convince her. She's not the only one. We move on to this. The women return from the tomb, tell the things to the 11. They don't believe them. They don't believe the stories. Peter arose and ran to the tomb, stooping down. He saw the claws lying by themselves. He sees the empty tomb, and all we hear is he departed, marveling to himself, like, what is going on here? No indication that he thinks Jesus rose from the dead. Even when Jesus appears to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and they tell Jesus that certain women went to the tomb, they didn't find the body, they saw a vision of angels, certain of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. They still don't believe. Okay? Look at what they said again. We were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Okay? We were wrong. That's what we had been hoping, past tense, not hoping it anymore. Okay? They are no longer hoping despite the empty tomb. So think about this. If Jesus' closest followers, those who knew him personally, those who spent time with him, those who saw his miracles firsthand, were not convinced by an empty tomb, even though they saw it in person, do you think skeptics today, almost 2,000 years later, would be convinced by that? It's not an argument they would take seriously. So this is why I say this is not a good argument. Don't use it. Worst argument number 4. According to the gospel books, the first witnesses of the risen Jesus were women. Women were second-class citizens in those days and extremely restricted. Their testimony was not valued or even considered legally valid in first century Israel. Therefore, no one making up a story of a resurrection would have made the first witnesses to be women. That detail, therefore, indicates that the accounts are true. Is this a good argument? Well, it focuses on how restricted women were. And we all know that in the first century, they were very restricted. We've heard that they were not allowed to learn the Torah. They weren't allowed to talk to men in public. They had to wear veils. They couldn't hold jobs. The testimony was not legal. Have you heard those kind of things before? Do you think that's true? How do you know? Have you ever studied the evidence? Interesting, when you do, a very different picture emerges. We have all sorts of documentation from the ancient world of the time of women serving as witnesses in court cases. But in most cases, we don't even have to go beyond the Bible itself. Right? Is it true that women were not allowed to learn the Torah? Were they allowed to learn the Torah? Well, not only were they allowed to, it was commanded that they should. Okay? Deuteronomy 6:6-7, you shall teach them diligently to your children. And if people want to say, well, maybe that's just boys, well, look at Leviticus 6:18a, all the males among the children of Aaron. Okay? So they distinguish. When it's only boy children, they will put it that way. So they were commanded to teach Torah to women. Where do we get the idea that they were not allowed to learn Torah? Were women allowed to talk to men in public? It's amazing to me how many people blithely say, no, they weren't. And they read the Bible and they still say, no, they weren't. Yes, they were. Here's a few examples in the Bible, in the New Testament, of women talking to men in public. Nobody thought anything strange of that. They have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, so many. So who says women were not allowed to talk to in public? Of course they were. Were women required to wear veils in public? This one is actually quite funny. Okay? If you look at the Old Testament, you'll find that veils are mentioned 42 times. 25 of those are about the veil in the tabernacle. 2 of them are symbolic references. 1 is about Babylon. 3 times it's Moses who's wearing it. He came down from the mountain with his face shining and had to cover that. Twice Tamar, and she's using it as a deliberate disguise and perhaps a sign of a harlot. Once it's Rebecca, who clearly does not wear it most of the time. 5 times the Shulamite in the Song of Solomon. Once it's a luxury item, twice it's an occultic item for both men and women. In the New Testament, they are mentioned 12 times, 6 times about the veil in the temple, 5 times symbolic, and once the reference to Moses wearing it. So no, there's no indication that women were required to wear veils. Why do we think so? Where do we get that idea? Well, it goes back to a certain liberal scholar named Joachim Jeremias, who published this influential book way back in 1969, Jerusalem in the Time of Jesus. And he made the claim that when the Jewess of Jerusalem left her house, her face was hidden by an arrangement of 2 head veils. What's his evidence for this? Well, this is what he offers. From the Babylon Talmud, Mishnah Shabbat 65a, Arabian women may go forth veiled, and Median women may go forth with their cloaks thrown over their shoulders. Does this say anything about Jewish women? It talks about Arabian women, Median women. Nothing about Jewish women. And then Jeremiah adds an anecdote from Pesikta Rabati, which comes from the 9th century, not the 1st. The 9th century, by which time Israel was under Muslim control and Muslim law. In point of fact, 2 other scholars who looked at the evidence, Strack and Billerbeck, concluded from the Talmudic evidence that Jewish women did not normally wear veils. Okay? So this is how liberal scholarship operates. It makes claims that are not backed up by the evidence. It makes them boldly, confidently, and they count on the fact that most of us don't bother to check. Almost all evangelical scholars seem to accept the skewed picture of women's status and passes it on without ever checking. Were they allowed to hold jobs outside the home? Did they have social influence? What about Lydia, the seller of purple in Acts chapter 16, a rich, independent businesswoman? What about the prominent women mentioned in Acts 13:50, 17:12, and so many other examples? And this brings us to the claim that women's testimony was not accepted in 1st century Israel. This is also not true. There's absolutely no evidence to support the contention. On the other hand, there are a few examples only of official investigations in the New Testament, and in most cases, the sex of the witnesses is not specified. But there's one clear example, and that is this one in John chapter 9, when Jesus healed a man who was born blind, and the fellows subsequently got into battle with the Pharisees, who did not want to believe that Jesus had healed him. They wanted to discredit that claim. So first they said he didn't heal him. Then they started questioning whether the man was really born blind or not. And we read the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. They asked the parents, his parents answered them and said. Okay. This is a quasi-judicial investigation. This is where witnesses are needed. They call 2, and one of them is the father and one of them is the mother. Now, 2 witnesses was the minimum legal standard. You have to have at least 2. Okay? And here they have 2, one male, and the mother is a female. Okay? If her testimony were not legally valid, this would not be a legal finding because there would be only one. Of course, women's testimony was accepted. I wonder how often evangelicals read this passage and then blithely continue to aver that the testimony of women was not accepted. The knowledgeable skeptic will know all this, and that is why an argument like this is a bad argument that you shouldn't be using. If you come up against a knowledgeable skeptic, he will make you look and feel silly. Worst argument number 5, this is this new scholarly flavor of the month. The claim that 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 is actually a creed formulated by the early church and taught to Paul 3 years after his conversion, which is proof that the church believed in the resurrection from the very first. Now, this is the in thing among evangelical scholars. They find that this is such good evidence, so strong, that we don't have to worry about defending the gospel books anymore. It doesn't matter that they're written 30 years plus after the fact, because we have this creed, you see. Paul, 3 years after his conversion, went to Jerusalem, consulted with the apostles, Peter, and James, and they taught Paul this creed. And if the creed existed so early on, then surely the resurrection must have happened. This is so much earlier than any gospel book. Now, what creed are they talking about? It's this. If you look in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, Paul starts talking about the gospel which I preached to you, and then he gives you the early parts, the first parts of the gospel. The part that's in yellow, these scholars will say it's a creed. It's not something that Paul made up here as he wrote. It's not something Paul received by divine inspiration. It was a creed taught to him probably by Peter and James 3 years after his conversion. This is what they will say. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 is a very early pre-Pauline creed that Paul learned from earlier believers. Many scholars believe Paul received this creed from Peter and James while visiting with them in Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. It was apparently given to Paul by eyewitnesses. Okay? And so you see, this is such a good argument. How do we know that it's a creed? Well, the Gospels were written after almost all the letters of Paul, whose writing ministry began in the late 40s and went into the 60s, which would mean the Gospels were all written in the 60s, 30 years plus and after. To find the earliest information, one goes to Paul's epistles. We find that Paul incorporated some creeds. Now, notice what they're doing here. First, they are conceding the liberal claim that the gospel books were all written 30 plus years after Jesus' resurrection. That very claim that caused McDowell's protege to begin doubting. They receive this, pass it on without any question. They're telling that Paul is the earliest writer. That's where you go. Although Paul was not an apostle, personal apostle with Jesus during his time on earth, he never met him personally, but somehow his testimony is supposed to be more important than that of the actual gospel writers who are eyewitnesses. Okay? But that's okay. There are creeds. And they will try to give you reasons. If we have more time, we go into in detail on the reasons they claim for this and the problems with them. But here's the main thing from the point of view of a Christian. Okay? Look at this. The gospel which I preach to you, and that's followed by the supposed creed. Okay? Where did Paul get this creed from? The gospel which I preached to you, where did he get it? The scholar will tell you he was given it, he was taught it by human teachers. There's technical language indicating that. From Peter and James. And here's the big problem, folks. What does the Word of God say about it? Okay. Scott is saying Paul received this creed from men. The gospel which he preached, he received from men. What does the Word of God and Paul himself say? I want to make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is the same way he prefaced the supposed creed. The gospel which was preached by me is not according to man, for I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it. The scholars will tell you then that the gospel which I preached to you, says Paul, he received from men. The Word of God tells you that the gospel which was preached by me, I did not receive from man, nor was I taught it. Now, isn't that a problem? Isn't it a problem that we're making an argument in which the clever skeptic can say, wait a minute, you've just proven that Paul's a liar. You've just proven Paul's not reliable. You want us to believe what he says. You just told us he's not. You've also shown us that the Bible lies because Paul says he did not receive from men, and you're telling us he received it from men. Okay? Can we think of a worse possible argument than that? And yet, because they're so in love with this idea of the creed, they don't even have to defend the gospel books anymore. Let them be 30 years after the fact. Seems problematic to me. So I would say, in summary, then, these are your worst arguments for the resurrection. Okay? But don't worry, there are good arguments. Let's move on to the best arguments for the resurrection. Again, and it's not particular order to these. They're just the best arguments. Best argument number one is that this is eyewitness testimony in the gospel books. And eyewitness testimony is the gold standard of historical evidence both then and now. Anything we know about the past, things that are singular, non-repeatable events, depend on eyewitness testimony. It's not stuff you can discover scientifically, but it's equally credible. Lincoln's assassination, 1865, can't prove that scientifically. We need evidence for that. Hannibal crossing the Alps, we need eyewitness testimony. We need people there at the time on site to write it down and that writing to come to us. It's easy to demonstrate, for example, if I ask you where were you born and you give me the answer, I'll say, how do you know? Well, you could trot out your birth certificates, but you know what that is? That's eyewitness testimony written at the time, signed at the time. You can't prove it scientifically. Would you say, well, we can't believe it? No. Now, not only do we have eyewitness testimony, we have 4 accounts. 2 of them were written by apostles who actually walked around with Jesus for 3 or 4 years. One of them, Mark, was writing down the testimony of an apostle. He's writing down Peter's testimony as his agent. And the 4th tells us, Luke, that what he was writing down he received directly from eyewitnesses. Now, how does this compare to what is typical for ancient history? Because skeptics like Armin will tell you it's not very good stuff. The gospel, he says, the gospels were written 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death, not by people who are eyewitnesses. They were written by highly literate, trained, Greek-speaking Christians of the 2nd and 3rd generation. They're not written by Jesus' Aramaic-speaking followers. Okay? You'll hear this kind of claim all the time from the skeptics. If you read carefully, you'll see them in the newspapers, articles, magazine articles, books. If you look carefully, if you scratch beneath the surface of their claims looking for evidence to back these up, you won't find any. This is what you will find. Here's Robert Funk again of the Jesus Seminar. This is what he writes in his introduction to the 5 Gospels. The current assumption is more nearly the opposite. The Gospels are now assumed to be narratives in which the memory of Jesus is embellished by mythic elements and plausible fictions. Okay. Now you all know what the word assumed means, right? Just accept to be true without proof, without evidence. And it's not just Funk. Here's Gerhard Ludemann. Look at how many books he's written attacking the truth of Christianity. This is just a few of them. This is what he writes in What Jesus Didn't Say. There's long been a truism of biblical criticism that the New Testament isn't telling the truth. 3 presuppositions underlying my work are the following. First, the authors of the 4 Gospels of the New Testament are not known. Second, the authors were not eyewitnesses. Okay? Once again, what is a presupposition? A presupposition is something that's accepted to be true without evidence. Okay? These claims about how late the gospel books were, who wrote them, that's what they are. They're bald assertions. They're considered axioms. They ignore the actual evidence. You see this kind of thing all the time. Scholars have found that. Modern scholars tell us that. Scholars have shown. You will get this from skeptics all the time. But the fact is, scholars have not shown any of these claims. They assume them. They take them as presuppositions. They assert them, but they don't prove them. Quite the opposite. We have a lot of external evidence for the dates and the authorship of the gospel books from people in a position to know. We have early Christians telling us who wrote the gospel books. Matthew, the apostle. John, the apostle. Peter, the companion agent of Mark. Luke, the Gentile physician who worked with Paul. And these are early people in a position to know. Papias, by his own testimony, met the apostle John, checked on people who knew the gospel writers and knew the apostles. Irenaeus was a student of a man named Polycarp, who himself was a student of the apostle John. So we're talking about some people who are very, very early in a position to know. Besides that, we have the so-called family 35 colophons. And what these are is subscripts at the end of the gospel books in about 150 early manuscripts, where the date of writing The original date of writing is recorded in terms of how many years after the ascension of Christ. And so you have both the church fathers in a variety of different ways, plus these coffins all converging on these dates. Matthew was published about 8 years after the ascension of Christ. Mark was published 10 years after the ascension of Christ. Luke was published 15 years after the ascension of Christ. John was published 32 years after the ascension of Christ. Okay? All four of them were earlier than the earliest date assigned by liberals to the first gospel. At least two and probably three predate Paul's earliest letters. Okay? With such early dates, there's no possibility of later legendary accretions. There would be plenty of people around to prove them false. Okay, remember, this is how liberals would want you to have it, a non-existent Q document written in the 40s, and then Mark, and then Matthew and Luke all copying. It's completely bogus. When we look back at what Bart Ehrman said here, not as good as we'd like, it's nonsense. These are incredibly early eyewitness testimony. But let's demonstrate. Let's do a little comparison with some well-known characters from history. Alexander the Great. How many ancient accounts of his life and career? 5. The earliest, though, was written in the 1st century BC, so more than 300 years after Alexander's. Not eyewitness testimony, not even close. So Caesar Augustus, one of the 2 emperors during Jesus' sojourn on earth, 5 ancient accounts, but only one is an eyewitness account. Tiberius, the other emperor during Jesus' time, 4 ancient accounts, only one is an eyewitness account, and that only goes to the year 29. What about Julius Caesar and the Gallic Wars? There's 1 ancient account of that, and that's his own. Can anybody say bias? Okay. So this is the thing. People don't know context. They hear that, oh, this is not good evidence to have only 4 accounts and to have them only this far. It's much better than what we have for even great personages, political characters from history. And further points about this eyewitness testimony: the disciples knew Jesus well for 3 years or more, so it would not have been possible to foist an impostor on them. They did not just see momentary fleeting glimpses of Jesus, like spotting Elvis at a donut shop. They touched him, ate with him, spent time with him. The accounts are positioned in real time and space, inviting confirmation. It's not like a once upon a time thing, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away stuff. Luke tells exactly where it happened in real time, real space, when and where. The disciples were not easily convinced. Remember that. The empty tomb did not convince them. Even when the risen Jesus showed up, they were hard to convince. There were people who doubted. Even when Jesus finally appears to them, they're so against the idea that somebody can come back from the dead. At first, they thought he was a ghost. And he had to tell them, look at my hands and my feet. Look at the holes there. Touch it. Feel it. Spirits don't have flesh and bones. Okay? They're still not believing. It's too good to be true. He actually eat in front of them. And then finally they're convinced because ghosts don't eat. Thomas, who's not with them, he said, I don't care what you say. I don't believe it. Unless I see it personally, unless I can put my hands into the holes in his hands, and put my hand into that big gaping wound in his side, I will not believe. And you know what happens? Jesus shows up, tells Thomas to do these things, and Thomas says, my Lord and my God. Okay? So here's the upshot of all this. They're not trying to make themselves look good. They're not credulous. They found the resurrection as hard to believe as we would. But in the end, they believed it and preached it because the evidence was overwhelming. That's best argument number 1, eyewitness testimony. Best argument number 2, which we've already looked at, is the fact that these were written very early. Their dates are considered crucial to their status eyewitness testimony, which is why liberal scholars in the 18th century dated Matthew to 130, Luke to 150, and so on. Notice that they put exactly 100 years plus after Jesus' time to make sure it's not eyewitness testimony. Unfortunately for them, manuscript discoveries in the 20th century forced the scholars to admit that the gospel books were all written in the 1st century. None of them go into the 2nd. They still continue to push the dates as late as they can. Mark can't be earlier than 70, Matthew and Luke in the 80s, John in the 90s. And most evangelical scholars blindly accept this late dating. They claim the gospel books were in decades after the resurrection, which is not true. And the Testament gospel books is de-emphasized or ignored in favor of the creed. Liberal scholars, 2 slides there. Liberal scholars are actually happy to play along and ignore the gospel books in favor of the creed, because even if it were a creed, there's no way to date it. Any date up to shortly before his first visit to Corinth is possible. So here we have Matthew 8 years after the resurrection, Mark 10 years after, Luke 50 years after, versus the creed 17 years after, which is firmer evidence. Okay? The dates of the gospel books combined with their eyewitness testimony is powerful and conclusive evidence. So there's your first two best arguments. Eyewitness testimony, record the gospel books were written very early. Now people might say, oh, but they couldn't have been eyewitnesses. Now if they've 30 years, there would be no eyewitnesses. Well, people don't understand that in point of fact, even in the ancient world, people living to 60, 65, 70, 80 was not rare. The lower lifespans due to the fact that a lot of people died young and mortality was high and people died in wars. But 60 to 65 is commonly mentioned in ancient writings as the threshold of old age. After 30 years, you'd have 18 to 20,000 eyewitnesses of Jesus still alive. Even 60 years later, you'd have 600 to 1,100. So if anyone wants to argue it's too late for eyewitnesses, no. Best argument number 3, the message for which early Christians sincerely died. People might die for a life they believe it to be the truth, but no one would die for what they know to be a lie. And the disciples were in a position to know. So why would they fake the message? Well, one would fake a message to gain wealth, or power, or prestige. One does not fake a message that calls one to turn the other cheek, love his enemies, and suffer persecution, martyrdom, and then die for that message knowing it to be a lie. As a police like to say, follow the money. Cui bono, who profits from it? Well, these apostles did not profit, quite the opposite. Best argument number 4, the testimony of Josephus. You may not have heard of Flavius Josephus. He was a Jewish historian writing in the 1st century AD. Pretty much the only historian we have from that time period, him and Philo. He was a very good historian, though by no means perfect. He wrote The Wars of the Jews in 75, Antiquities of Jews in 94, Against Appian in 97, and so on. And what people don't know is that he does talk about Jesus. In his book, The Antiquities of Jews, section 18.3.3, he writes this. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. So that's pretty good. That's like a 5th testimony. Now, it's too good for liberal skeptics, of course. What can they do? They can just claim that it's not authentic. I know this was added in later by Christians, and not surprising, our evangelical scholars fall all over themselves to agree with them. They made some kind of a Faustian bargain where they say, look, if you don't say it's all fake, we'll say it's partly true and we'll take out the parts you don't like. The early Christians thought it was a wonderful and thorough, authentic attestation of Jesus. They loved it. Not until the Enlightenment, where we want to get rid of God, do some scholars question it. And now there's a remarkable consensus that the passage as a whole is authentic, although there may be interpolations. Early Christian copyists inserted some phrases. Okay? So it's authentic as long as everything of substance is ripped out. Not a really good bargain to make with liberal scholarship. Why they're giving away the story, I'm not sure. Okay? They say, oh, if indeed one ought to call him a man, that implies Jesus was more than human, which appears to be an interpolation. He was the Christ, that's an interpolation, because elsewhere he says, call the Christ, and no one would write that in one place that he's the Christ, and elsewhere write that he would be called the Christ. So this must have been added. On the third day he appeared to them restored to life. Well, that's a declaration of belief in the resurrection, and thus it's unlikely that Josephus wrote it. Okay? You understand? Everything that actually proves the resurrection of Jesus, that's proof in Josephus. Our scholars will tell you they're not there. Well, okay, even so, there's important information. He was martyred, leader of the church in Jerusalem, wise teacher, established a wide and lasting following, crucified and put instigation of Jewish leaders. Wow, what important information. Aren't we lucky? Just happens to be the very facts that liberals accept. Ripping out everything of substance. But there's no need to. Okay? If indeed one ought to call a man, they will tell you this is a Christian interpolation. Really? Would any Christian write about Jesus if indeed one ought to call him a man when the Bible is very clear that Jesus was a man? They'll tell you this is an interpolation. He was the Christ. Elsewhere he says he was called the Christ. It's unlikely Josephus would have flatly said Jesus was the Messiah here, when elsewhere he just said called the Christ. Really? Matthew 1:16-17. Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. From the captivity in Babylon until the Christ are 14 generations. The Bible says Jesus called Christ and then calls him Christ in consecutive verses. And our scholars are telling us, oh no, somebody wouldn't do that. Exact same wording in Greek as in Josephus, by the way. On the third day, this is a declaration of belief in the resurrection, so it's unlikely Josephus wrote it. Well, why not? If he's a good historian and that's what the evidence says, why wouldn't he write it? Well, then why wouldn't he convert? How do we know he didn't? Okay. Well, Eusebius says so, writing in the 4th century, and somehow suddenly 4th century testimony is so valid when it suits their purposes. But it's a moot point. Let me introduce you to Pinchas Lapid, a modern Israeli theologian. In 1982, he set about examining the case for the resurrection of Jesus to disprove it. He looked fairly at the evidence and concluded that Jesus did indeed rise from the dead. But at the same time, he said, well, that's just for the Gentiles. So he didn't convert. He affirmed Jesus rose from the dead and didn't convert. So Josephus could have done the same thing. So in point of fact, there's no real evidence for it, against it. All the evidence is for it. Why we're giving up, I don't know. But that, folks, is the best argument number 4. Number 5, the conversion of the Jews in Jerusalem. We know that so many Jews converted to Christ very quickly after the apostles started preaching. And remember that these are people who were trained from birth not to bow the knee and call Lord anyone other than God. And yet, within a few weeks, that's exactly what they're doing by the thousands. By the thousands. What convinced them to bow the knee to Jesus and call him Lord if it was not the resurrection? Even priests. Okay? Because that is what the apostles were preaching. God raised him up. This Jesus, God raised up. The resurrection of the Christ, God raised him from the dead. There it is, again and again and again. That is their message. We are witnesses of these things. Nothing else could have convinced those Jews to convert when they're that close to the events, except that the resurrection was true. Best argument number 6, the eyewitness challenge. Going back to 1 Corinthians 15:3-7, it's not a creed. But as Paul is telling them that all these more than 500 witnesses are still alive, folks. We are asking you to believe the resurrection, believe in Christianity. If it's true, you will have eternal life. If it's not true, you'll have, well, either way, you'll have persecution. Are you going to accept it at the cost of persecution? Yes, if it's true. So if you can check with eyewitnesses, would you? Yes, you would. And if the eyewitnesses didn't back up what Paul was saying, that would be the end of Christianity right there. What can skeptics do with this? They'll say, well, those days travel was difficult. They wouldn't really have gone to check. They overlook the fact that Jews, especially Jewish males, were required to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem at least once every single year for Passover. So yes, they did indeed go. They wouldn't even have to make a separate trip to check. You see in Acts 2:5, look at all Jews from every nation under heaven, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, those from Mesopotamia, and so on. Of course they got there. And of course they could have checked. And don't forget there was a very efficient postal system as well. They would have checked. If Paul's claim was not backed up, Christianity would have died in the cradle. And yet here it is today. So they're your best arguments for the resurrection. Best argument number 7, the final one. This is the one I brought up first, which I said people would consider not to be a good argument at first blush. But let me show you why it is. Okay? It may take a bit of time for the power of the argument to grow on you, but it will. First, let me show you this list of names and ask you, do you recognize any of them? I don't think you recognize any of them. Even specialist historians probably wouldn't. Let's move on now. This article written in Free Inquiry magazine, an atheist skeptic magazine, this fellow, David Clark, claims he's got a wonderful new argument disproving the resurrection. And that was that there's no audience gathered at the tomb to see the resurrection of Jesus. Why were they not there? Right? Jesus foretold the resurrection. Why were they not there to see it? You would expect that some people would be there just waiting. He concludes, therefore, that Jesus never even claimed it. If he claimed it, they would have been there at the tomb. Wrong answer. Wrong answer. The presumed certainty that dead people do not return to life was such that even Jesus' own disciples did not believe that he would rise. That's why they weren't there. We already saw how difficult they were to convince. Okay? You see, Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. What did his followers expect? They expected victory, not death. Okay? What did the fact that he died mean? It meant that he was not the Messiah. Okay? A Jewish messianic claimant who claims to be dead, claims to be Messiah and dies and stays dead is not the Messiah, and you look for somebody else. Okay? We see examples of that even in the New Testament itself. Gamaliel talks about Theudas, who made these kind of claims, got a lot of followers, then he was slain, and all who obeyed him were scattered and came to nothing. Judas of Galilee, same thing, made the messianic claims, drew many people after him. He also perished, and all who obeyed him were dispersed. Okay? So the Jewish Messiah has to triumph. If he dies and he stays dead, he proves he's not the Messiah. No one will keep following him, let alone try to persuade others to do so. And mostly nobody does. Okay? What do? So what they do, they look for another. They look for another. Because they're looking for a Messiah for a reason. They want the true Messiah, the one who can actually save them. When a person proves he's not the true Messiah, they don't keep following him. So these names again, these are all people who claim to be the Jewish Messiah. That's a partial list only. There are more than 50 through history who claim to be the Jewish Messiah. Why have you not heard of any of them? Because they all died. They all stayed dead. And when that happens, nobody follows them anymore. Nobody preaches them anymore. Yet they followed Jesus and they preached to Jesus. Okay? And it's not just in ancient times. Here's a relatively recent one. Menachem SCHNEERSON was the Rebbe of the Chabad Lubavitcher sect of Orthodox Judaism. His movement took off in the 1980s. Many or most of his followers came to believe he was the long-awaited Messiah. And then he died in 1994. And what happened? According to the Washington Post, even as his pine coffin was placed in the hearse, a panicked crowd of Lubavitch faithful chanted prayers for SCHNEERSON to rise and reveal himself to be the Messiah, for whom Jews have waited since time immemorial. Within 3 days, the movement was already sundering, as some claim that he would rise from the dead imminently. Well, that's almost 26 years now. He's not risen. He's not going to. And nobody's still following him. Maybe a few old friends. Nobody's preaching him. Nobody's converting to him. Nobody makes up stories that he rose from the dead and they saw him, because if he doesn't actually rise from the dead, he can't save you. Okay? This is why they follow Messianic. They believe he's the Messiah. They believe he'll give them victory and eternal life. If he dies in defeat, he has proven he cannot give you those things. Why would you make up a story that he came back from the dead to legitimize him when you know that he cannot give you those things? He's just another dead man like Theudas and Judas of Galilee and any of those 50 Jewish messiahs. The track record is clear. If you're a Jewish messianic claimant, you either rise from the dead or you're forgotten. It's the only two options. Tough followers claim he rose when he didn't, just does not happen. Here's another recent one, Sun Myung Moon. He died in 2012. He didn't come back. Okay? The second reason then is, why did not the followers of Buddha claim their leader rose from the dead, seen by witnesses? Or the followers of Muhammad, or Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, or Baha'u'llah, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, or anybody other than Jesus? They don't do that. Only the followers of Jesus ever made such a claim. And why is that? Because a claim that a man who's been killed a short time ago is risen from the dead, being seen by many eyewitnesses, is a claim like saying to a paralytic, arise, take up your bed and walk. It is subject to instant verification. Either there really are numerous eyewitnesses who testify that they saw the risen Jesus after his death by crucifixion, and testify even at the cost of persecution that may be deadly, or the claim will be exposed as a fraud immediately. And that is why no one whose leader did not rise from the dead will claim he did. The chance that the movement will be discredited immediately is far too high. The only ones who dare to make such a claim are those whose leader actually did rise from the dead, who do have the eyewitnesses that testified, and the only ones who did that were the followers of Jesus Christ. So there you go, folks. Worst arguments that are often brought up by Christians. Don't use them. We don't need them. We have so many good arguments. Learn these, know how to use them. It's irrefutable proof, folks. Jesus rose from the dead, proving himself to be the Son of God, and a sure basis for faith and for evangelism.